So the theme tonight, we have three things we're going to talk about. Number one is obviously how to grow and scale your career. Two, we're going to get into some war stories. You got quite the background, especially when it comes to growth and marketing from Wealthfront, Quora, mainly, maybe a little Facebook and Twitter. And then what are Silicon Valley investors looking for outside of Silicon Valley, most importantly, because I'm sure most of us fall in that category. So let's get started. First question, how'd you get into tech?
Okay, nice wide open one. It's a fun story, actually. I don't know if my head's magnetic or.
Is that metal plate?
So the way I got into tech was incredibly non-conventional, and that's going to be sort of my first point of advice, which is to take unconventional paths when it comes to your career. And let me explain how. I went to UCLA. I was an awful student. I had a 2.6 GPA. That was after I got straight A's my senior year to bring up the GPA just to show future employers that I could do it if I wanted to. But during college, I focused on employment, and I probably worked about 30 hours a week when I was a student. At the end of college, I found out, like most undergraduates from a liberal arts university, that the job prospects are not very exciting when you have a poor GPA with a liberal arts degree. And so I couldn't really get any interesting jobs right away. In fact, I went home and I worked on the family farm after college graduation. I grew up on a small farm, and I said, you know what? I'm going to go back, I'm going to work on the farm, and I will make whatever money I need to pay off these student loans, and then I'll do whatever it takes to find my opportunity into an interesting professional career. And the thing that I initially did at first was I submitted my resume or my application like every other new college grad, and it would just get lost in a pile of 500 other resumes that looked no different than mine. And so that's when I started an unconventional approach, where I would go to coffee shops on weekends, and I would sit there for hours researching CEOs of companies who were people that I admired, both professionally and personally, because of who they were. And what I decided was I was going to email them directly, and I was going to introduce myself, and I was going to see if I could get a job that way. I did that for a couple of months, and a few CEOs responded. Some said, hey, I appreciate the email, but I don't have anything for you right now. One of the CEOs said, sure, let's meet up when I get back from my business trip to New York City. And so he and I met at his office in Los Angeles. His office was about half the size of this room. It was one of those offices that's so big that they have house furniture in it. And I sat down on his couch, and I was waiting for him to get off the phone with some of the bankers from New York City that he was talking to. And he got off the phone finally. He came over and he sat down across from me and he said, what do you want? And a deer in headlights, my response was, I want your job someday. And which I had no idea what I was talking about. All I knew was he was successful professionally. He seemed like a really good person because of the philanthropy that he did. He was a family man, and it struck me as the type of person that I wanted to be someday. And that is how I made the decision to determine what sort of company and who I wanted to work for. It was based on what kind of life I envisioned myself having someday. And so it was from a coffee shop in a small town in Central California in a little farming community that the initial introduction to a CEO who was running a technology company happened. And he and I kept in touch. We would grab lunch every couple of weeks. And then one day when I was in his office, he flagged one of his VPs over, and he introduced me to this person. And he said, Andy's now working for us. I'd like you to meet Andy. And he created a job for me on the spot. And my job was to be the assistant to the executive staff, which in a startup basically meant whatever they need, do it. And don't bat an eye, don't hesitate, just do what they need. And that was when I was introduced to what it meant to be a great executive from day one of my very first professional job outside of college, which I was incredibly lucky and fortunate to have that opportunity. And it taught me a lot about what I needed to do eventually career-wise in order to give back to other people who are up and coming just like I was at the time. So that's how I got into tech. I emailed CEOs, and one of them, he found a room for me, and that's when I began learning the world of software within the walls of his company.
Interesting. Any weird action items that you had to do consistently?
Oh, yeah. So not weird, but they were sort of all over the place. There were many times in which I was editing and negotiating contracts with large banks. I had no business doing that, but that's what you do within a startup. Little did Wachovia know that a 21-year-old kid was on the other side editing contracts with no law degree. That's how startups work, right? I was sourcing real estate for our next call center. I was training our call center folks because for whatever reason it turned out that I was good at doing that. And then eventually they would send me out on some sales calls where I was selling our product and our business in person, and I just went into it completely naive and just said, well, I'm gonna do what comes natural. I had no training whatsoever, but my close rate was 95% on the first sales pitch that I gave at what eventually ended up being one of our big partners, and I had no idea that that was a good number. And so I came back into the office and had a big stack of contracts. And the CEO was like, well, I've got a new job for you. So I did some time in sales. Eventually I ended up being one of our managers with our big banking partners and running those relationships. Mm-hmm. But I just did everything and anything that the company needed.
So legal, finance, marketing, and sales as a first hire. That sounds pretty typical for startup land.
It was not typical, and I made some seriously boneheaded mistakes, but it was a great experience. So that's how I got into tech, and my advice to everyone here is take unconventional paths. By its definition, taking the conventional path, you shouldn't expect unconventional outcomes or returns. You should expect average outcomes or returns. You have to go against the grain sometimes. And so whenever I get the opportunity to chat with undergraduates today, that's the very first thing I tell them is quit applying for a job the same way a couple million other people are.
Mm-hmm. So going into that, the path there is, let me not apply for this company because this company does X, Y, and Z, right? He said, okay, there's this guy manning the ship that's leading the charge, and he has certain values and aspirations that it sounded like you wanted to follow. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. Because as a 21-year-old with a college degree, how could I actually assess what are good companies or good industries or great technologies? Like, there's no way of doing that. The typical thing to do is you sort of apply for the roles that you see other successful undergraduates applying to, whether that's finance or consulting, or potentially go to law school or medical school. Like there are sort of these really big veins of common outcomes in finance and healthcare, and I sort of explored those. I had a very brief internship at Morgan Stanley, and very quickly realized that this sucks, I hate it, and I want no part of this. There's an amazing story behind that too, which I'm happy to go into at some point. But yeah, I mean, my approach was go work for somebody whose life I wanted mine to resemble.
Okay, so now we all know how to get a job and get in there, but then what, right? So now you're like, all right, I'm going to get into tech. I'm going to find the CEOs I want to follow. How do you think about scaling your career path along with that? Was it something of like, oh wow, I seem to be good at this, so I'm just going to stay on? Was it planning? Was it more times in the coffee shop?
Yeah. So when you're joining a startup, it's actually quite beneficial to be a generalist, right? Because you may be the head of finance, but then 2 hours a week you're building desks out of IKEA furniture, right? Like you need to do a little bit of everything. But eventually, especially for a startup that hits product market fit and begins to experience some scale and success, focus is the key. And so the analogy I like to draw is to Amazon's business, right? Starting with a single focus on selling books, becoming exceptional at that, such that they could use that momentum to expand into market adjacencies. And the same is true professionally, especially within hyper-growth startups and technology companies. where the thing that you should focus on is find one area of expertise that you can go really, really deep on, that is essential to the success of that company, and to deliver. That's the most important thing you can do. An example of this was early on when I was at Facebook. I was hired in, and I was vastly outgunned in terms of how talented and intelligent everyone there was. But I chose one thing to focus on, which was search engine optimization, SEO. It eventually ended up being 20% of Facebook's growth. And I was the sole person, in addition to one other engineer who was my lead engineer, and the two of us were running all of SEO for Facebook, which at that time was the largest indexable website in the world by a significant margin. And because I delivered really, really well on that aspect of the business, other opportunities presented itself. Because a key part of this is the psychology of executives or managers and leaders. So imagine that you're the CEO, founder of a company. And let's say that you start to scale, you're starting to have some success. And then this big new initiative reveals itself. You realize that, hey, there's this huge opportunity that we need to pursue. And as one of the leaders of the company, one of the things that you do somewhat unconsciously or subconsciously is you go through the mental Rolodex of who within this company is the person that I want to task with taking on this new initiative. And the way the psychology of leadership works is the people you think of are the ones who had a singular task that was important, and they delivered on that exceptionally well. You do not think about the generalist who did a little bit of everything okay. Because this one new area of the business is so important, you don't just want somebody who's going to deliver it in a mediocre fashion. You want somebody who's exceptional. And I've seen this play out time and time again. So early on in my career, I came in on the first startup that I got engaged with through the CEO as very much so a generalist. But within a year, all of a sudden I was retasked with a new job where I had a singular focus, and eventually I was running 60% of the revenue for the company. And because of that, for just one person, I had outsized impact on the business. And the same thing ended up happening when I went over to Facebook. And I effectively continued that for, I'd say, the first 8 to 10 years of my career. But what ends up happening is, like at Facebook, when I started search engine optimization, I became well known for performing and providing value from that perspective. And so people began reaching out to me to ask for me to take on other initiatives. And then that's how career growth happens, right? Is you're so good at one thing, everybody else in the organization then says, hey, can you come and do this new thing? And the next thing you know, 8 to 10 years later, you're not only exceptional at one thing, but you're exceptional at 3 or 4 or 5 things. And that's because you focused on one at a time. And what ended up happening for me is, especially once I went over to Wealthfront, there were at least half a dozen different things that I had true expertise in as a result of focusing within these other tech companies I was at, such that that was the bedrock for me to become an executive, where an executive really needs to have expertise, but also across a broad set of different subjects or knowledge. So yeah, that's the advice I would give, is if you come in, just to summarize, if you come in an early stage startup, be prepared to be a Swiss Army knife and do whatever the company needs. Eventually, what you should do, and I would argue within the first year or two, find one thing that you can go very deep on that the company is going to get immense value from. Put your head down, put your headphones on, focus, and so long as the company is succeeding, and if you deliver on that one thing, new opportunities will present itself.
So there's plenty to do there, plenty of good things, plenty of good paths, but what about the other side of it? What should we not do coming into a company, or are there any stories that you have that...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I learned a lot about what not to do, largely from making many of these mistakes myself, but also from just observing other very smart people around me not perform or succeed, and realizing it had nothing to do with intelligence, really. So some of the anti-patterns, this is sort of the flip side of what I mentioned around focus, which is don't be a mile wide and an inch deep. this is really common, for example, within marketing as a function. So it's common for a marketer to say, like, I want to be a CMO someday. So day one, they enter a startup, and they're like, let me do email and SEO and paid marketing and affiliates, and they try and do everything, right? So they end up being a mile wide and an inch deep, meaning they have very little expertise in any one of those. So avoid doing that. The other is, don't complain without bringing up solutions. Like, the existence of a startup is everything is broken. Right? Everything is broken. And then when you fix something else, you probably broke 2 other things. And that's just the way it is. Like, there's this very sort of Buddhist approach you have to take where it's like, yeah, stuff's broken. I'm okay with that. And you just truly accept it. The thing I hate is when people come to me and they're like, oh, our data's a mess, and this doesn't work, and this person's slacking off, and they present no solutions. I don't want to hear it. No leader wants to hear it. If you have a reasonable solution and you're going to immediately go and solve that problem, okay, I'll listen. Otherwise, don't complain without bringing solutions to the table at the same time. The other mistake to avoid is, and this may be somewhat obvious, is don't hop from one company to the next simply because this other company is going to pay you 10 grand more or is going to give you a title that sounds a little bit better, right? So for example, when I was at Facebook with myself and with the lead engineer where we were running SEO, I remember we needed to hire. And so we put out some job postings and we were going to hire a 3rd person onto our team. And then this was right at the time in which we started to overtake MySpace. The writing was on the wall. In an 18-month period, they went from having 100 million users in the United States, and we had 5 million, to that completely flipped. And so lo and behold, we ended up getting a lot of applicants from MySpace who were then trying to come and work at Facebook. And the thing that stood out to me is I must have read at least 3 or 4 different resumes from senior SEO managers at MySpace. And I remember thinking, how many senior managers of SEO do they need? Why do they need a senior manager to begin with? Why do they even need one? And if there's 3 or 4 senior SEO managers, how big is the SEO team as a whole? It turns out it was like 15 or 20 people. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, well, we are completely usurping that business, and we're able to deliver on search engine optimization for Facebook with a team of 2. And the thing that I noticed is that people were hopping from one company to the next, and they'd hopped into MySpace because they had what I call title bloat. They would just throw any absurd, really sort of lofty sounding title out there so that they could attract talent. But what ends up happening is the title far outpaces your actual skill or ability. And that title itself only matters insofar as it helps you get hired by other bad companies that are also going to deploy that same tactic. So like, the titles don't matter. The extra 10K in pay, except for in certain cases, doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is, are you a part of a company that's going to succeed? Because your career success or the trajectory of your career is proportional to the trajectory of the companies you've been at. And so I know really, really good, talented people who are far better than I am or I have been out of sheer effort and intellect. But the companies they chose were poor companies. The companies weren't growing, and consequently, their career didn't have the same potential.
Sounds like a lot of pattern matching, value matching, career growth trajectory matching. When you look back on it, like, what would you say to young Andy, 22, coming in? Like, if there's like 1 or 2 things to say, completely avoid this decision, or you should definitely try this instead of that, like, what would that be?
Wow. That's a good question. I would probably say remain authentic. Don't try and be anybody else. Pursue the things that you find interesting. And there are a lot of very, very smart people whom all of us, I'm sure, have turned to at some point in our life that ultimately end up giving bad advice, not because they want to give bad advice or not because they aren't intelligent, thoughtful people, but at the end of the day, they don't know you as well as you know yourself. And when I reflect on where, my career path and how I've gotten to where I'm at today, there are 2 or 3 pivotal decisions that I made that were contrarian in the sense that the very smart people around me who were giving me advice disagreed with those decisions I made. Going to Wealthfront was one of them. It was a small startup of 10 or 15 people. It wasn't really talked about. People thought it sounded boring because it's finance. I actually find it pretty interesting. And the advice I was given at the time was to do the conventional thing, take the obvious route. Go join Snapchat, go do another one of those social products that was going like this. I didn't care about it. I didn't want to work on it. I'd gone through that with Facebook and Twitter and Quora, and I had my fill with that type of business. And it would have been really easy and intellectually dishonest for me to say, sure, I'll take that job with that next high-flying company with a big fancy title. But it didn't sit well with me because it already had 100 million users, and I didn't do anything to earn that. I wasn't a part of building the company early on to get it to that stage, and so I didn't want to be a part of these obvious bets anymore. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to work on something that might end up being 1/10 the value of that company, but to play a role at that business, in Wealthfront in this case, early on, such that if it ends up being $1 billion company someday, I can say I had a really big part of that. And the problem that they were trying to solve, when I listened to the founders, I could relate to it. It felt authentic, not only in the way that they explained it and described it, but it seemed like a way I wanted to spend my life professionally. And so that's where I made a contrarian decision and went with this thing that nobody really believed in at the time. And now it is significantly bigger and larger, and the majority of the investors and experienced professionals who gave me the advice to not be a part of it back in 2013, over the last couple of years, they've all followed up and said, good decision.
Oh, that bittersweet conversation. Those are good ones. Those are great. So let's hop into growth. It looks like your path from early SEO days all the way through being a president has followed the track of marketing per se, or sales and growth, right? So I want to talk about 3 areas when it comes to growth. There's pre-product market fit, right? That means you're early stage. You're trying to figure out your channel. You're trying to figure out how to get your product in the hands of the right people and get that to scale. And then there is product market fit. And what the hell is product market fit? Let's define that. And then post. Then what, right? Once you get past that. So I think what we should start with is, I think the underlying issue in Miami, if you look, Miami was number 2 for early stage companies, and we were dead last for growth. That means there's a chasm that we need to cross there, right? So, and that chasm's product market fit. It's early stage innovators getting out, wanting to grow their companies, and just missing that. So, first, what the hell is product market fit, and what's the target, and how do we know when we get there?
Yeah. So this is my definition of it. There are some people I know who would probably yell at me for saying this, or they might agree. I don't know. For me, it's having a very precise product for an even more precise customer, such that when you deliver that product to that very precise customer, it delights them in a way that then drives exponential organic growth. That last part is probably the most important, the exponential organic growth. So let me give an example with Wealthfront. Are folks here familiar with Wealthfront, by the way? I should raise your hand if you've never heard of it. That way I can give some context. So it's, imagine you had 50 million bucks. All right, that'd be pretty nice. So imagine it for a moment. You could go to, say, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. They will assign a team of people, and that team of people is what they call wealth management, and they will manage your money for you as a very rich individual. That includes sophisticated investment management, some financial planning, and they'll do some banking for you as well. Wealthfront is effectively trying to build that completely online, right? So no big fancy offices, no high investment fees and minimums, no hidden expenses, no misaligned incentives between the financial institution and the customer, and just delivered entirely online in a way that's automated, right? So you don't even have to do any of the investing. Our software does it for you. So that's Wealthfront, right? And early on, we had the same challenge of, okay, we've got this idea, we have this concept, it seems very compelling. What if we built a better version of a large financial institution entirely online, low cost, and aligned directly with the customer? Let's go ahead and build it. So the founders of the company built, along with a couple engineers, built the initial prototype for the product. And the team sat down and we said, okay, we need to define who is the specific customer that this product would be appropriate for. Who's going to want this thing? One of the mistakes that most startups make very early on is they market and they position their product far too broadly. Because what you end up doing is you try and position it to everyone, and what ends up happening is it doesn't stand out. It's not compelling to anybody. And so by trying to market it to everyone, you've marketed the product to nobody. And so we took this initial prototype, and the founders sort of came up with a definition of who this target customer was. And at the time, the target customer was quite precise. It was engineers in the Silicon Valley who were right on the cusp of having a windfall from like an IPO, making $1 million from Facebook stock, or who had just had a windfall, who are technology adopters, so they have a tendency to prefer convenient software-based solutions. They usually were in their 20s. Most of them were single at the time, and they had no existing relationship with a large financial institution in terms of managing their money. And in fact, they didn't want one. That was the target customer.
Right? What was the size of that market at the time?
Just a few thousand people. And if you think about it, like, you guys remember the Tesla Roadster? The first Tesla that they sold? How many did they sell? Does anyone know? About 3,000. Pretty fascinating, right? Precise target customer, right? The sort of customer that would buy a $130,000 sports car, knowing the very real risk that that company would go out of business and they would end up with a $130,000 brick, right? That's how you know you have the target customer, where they are going to disregard all the risks and the concerns, because when they see your product, they say, that's what I want, that's what I need, this is the future, and I'm going to buy this, right? And that's what Tesla did very well with the Roadster. So on the Wealthfront side, we had that target customer definition, and some of the early employees said, all right, well, where are those target customers? They were at companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, which had just had an IPO or were on the verge of having an IPO. And we would go into the office in the middle of the day and give free investment seminars to like 2 and 3 engineers at a time. And like book a conference room in LinkedIn's campus, and then the founders of the company doing this. And then for an hour would teach them, like, here's what great investing looks like. They didn't teach them, here's what Wealthfront does. They taught them, here's what great investing looks like, and tried to provide and deliver value in the absence of selling. And then some of those engineers would say, okay, this is really helpful. Do you have a product that does what you just described? Well, in fact, we do, right? And that's how Wealthfront got started, like 2 engineers at a time. And then as they were looking at customer acquisition early on, it was slow going. It's like 1 or 2 a day. Sometimes there were no signups in a given day. But then eventually things started to change. We saw that 2 signups from engineers turned into 5 engineers, and then 10 engineers, and then 15. And then a product manager would come in, and we're like, what's going on right now? And then a designer and some data scientists. It began to cross these functions within the company as word was spreading. And Wealthfront grew to the first $1 billion of assets under management in 2.5 years with 0 paid marketing, virtually 0 marketing at all. It was entirely built from hand. And the same is true with Cora, which I can go into detail on. But it's important because, as I mentioned, exponential organic growth. That's what we observed, all right? And that was happening within the walls of these companies. And if you fast forward to today, Wealthfront has about $12 billion of assets, and the overwhelming vast majority of growth is entirely organic.
So that's a great story. I'm sure a lot of us would like to have that similar story. It was almost like an enterprise sale in the beginning. You're going into companies, something unconventional way of going out and educating them on, you know, their future problem.
Well, here's the important part of that is whenever I see a young startup say that they're going to go to market with paid marketing because it's so lightweight and they might spend $5,000 to sort of do a smoke test, that's okay if they tell me that there are a few specific things that they want to test and learn, but I get really, really weary because it implies that they're immediately stepping back from the customer, right? To establish product market fit, you need to know like your first 100, your first 1,000 customers inside and out, like face to face know these folks. In the words of Steve Blank, you know, he'd say, "Get the fuck out of the building," right? It's like there are no truths within these walls. They're all outside. And you have to go and extract those truths from who you think your target customer is going to be. And we had some experiences early on that by remaining very, very close with these early adopters, that we were able to transform the product and accelerate the business even further. So here's an example. The original product was quite basic. You would put some money in, and then it would build an investment portfolio for you, and then it would do some very basic stuff to manage that investment portfolio. And some of these engineers, being pretty savvy and they like building stuff and doing things on their own, we started to hear quite often, they would say, "This is cool, I buy into it, but I can do this myself. You know, I have my Excel spreadsheets, I have my macros, I wrote some scripts," and you know, they had hacked together their own very basic way of managing an investment portfolio the way our software did. And we heard that enough from our customers by staying close to them that we said, okay, well, we've got to build something they can't do. And if we build the right thing that adds a lot of value and they can't replicate it themselves, they're going to give us more of their money. Seems reasonable. And so a few folks within the company started to discuss, you know, what can we build? And one of the advisors to the business actually suggested, well, what about this thing called tax loss harvesting? Ignore that word for the time being because I saw everyone just glaze over. It's a fancy way of saying that while your portfolio is invested, occasionally you make trades that lower your taxes in that given time frame or in that year, but also allow you to remain invested in the market at the same time, right? So you're still invested, but the software is working to lower your tax bill. Now, it turns out that if you're a wealthy investor, like I mentioned, somebody with 50 million bucks, you've had this service of tax loss harvesting for a long time. It's completely legal, it fits within the tax code, and it's rigorously tested, academically proven. It's a real thing. It's just the vast majority of folks, like everyone in this room, had never heard of it before. And so we said, well, this is a real deal. It will improve the risk and tax-adjusted returns of the investors' portfolios. It's actually quite difficult to implement if you don't know what you're doing. And software could do it even better than people with paperwork can at JP Morgan. And so we said, well, you know, let's build one, right? So we talked to some customers. We sold them on the idea early on before we'd actually even built it. The responses that we got back seemed very promising, so we went in and we built the product based on consistently hearing that user feedback from our early adopters. So I think Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, you could get the service for if you had $5 or $10 million with them. With us, we rolled it out at $100K. We said, you know what? If it's that good of a service and the feedback that we collected is accurate, well, then people are going to put more money into their account to get access to this. And so we rolled it out, we launched the product, and it was the first of its kind in terms of a direct-to-consumer tax loss harvesting service. It was even more impressive than what human traders or brokers or wealth managers can do, because software is constantly working versus your wealth manager's got to sleep at some point. We rolled it out, and then money started flying in, right? And the business really accelerated from that point on.
So when prior to product market fit, did you guys have enough cash in the bank to withstand a certain amount of years, or did you need to hit a certain milestone and then go out and do another grab? Because the margins from that side, like you guys had to hit maybe $2 billion or more to actually show meaningful revenue, I would assume, because you were slashing all the fees significantly, right?
Well, and Wealthfront was the result of a pivot. It was first another startup called Kaching, which failed. And it was through conversations with the customer that we realized that the direction Kaching was going in was the wrong one. It literally needed to do a 180 from an investment philosophy standpoint. And so the company went through a pivot. We were very, very, very fortunate in that the CEO and founder of the company was capable of raising a couple $1 million to finance through the pivot. Otherwise, it would have been dead, no doubt.
Gotcha. So that's a big piece, you know. A lot of times you have to hit this number to actually get the next raise. It seems like that's the milestone that you have to reach, and it's you versus time in those areas, right? Before we get into more post stuff, like let's jump over to Quora, right? Like, has anybody had a question answered on Quora? Everyone? Does everybody know what Quora is?
Who doesn't know what Quora is? Okay, awesome.
Okay,
it's working.
so how the heck did all those answers get on there?
Yeah,
in
so
the beginning?
Quora, it's just a Q&A website, but done incredibly well. And it was a chicken and egg problem. It's like, how do you get people to write content on this website when there's no real reason for them to do so to begin with? And the way that we got Quora off the ground is we wrote all the content ourselves, right? And
did you answer your own questions?
No, we did not do that. We didn't talk to ourselves on Quora.
Or did the guy down the hall
yeah,
answer?
exactly.
You're like, I got this question. Let me get that guy to answer for me.
That absolutely did happen. You know, if we had somebody who was, for example, the former head of data science had a PhD in economics. And so if we wanted to put some of the original questions and answers on the subject of like game theory or economics, well, we were going to tap Yair on the shoulder and say, hey, can you do this? And so many of us first 20 employees had written enough content that it would be the equivalent to 1 or 2 or 3 full-length books. One of the original employees to this day is still the #1 producer of content on Quora. And he's done thousands of questions and answers. And so there were 2 key points of that, though. First was we needed to put in the original content to establish the momentum in the flywheel, right? Because if you write a high-quality piece of content and that is indexable by a search engine, somebody may search for a query that then leads you to a Quora answer, and then Quora's product needs to do a good job of converting that random visitor into a user who also eventually ends up becoming a producer. So we had to put that momentum in the flywheel ourselves, which we did. Everyone was very, very busy doing that. And then the other key part of it was Quora is about high-quality experiential knowledge. And we wanted people to produce or to share the best of their experiential knowledge at scale. But we needed to show them and demonstrate the sort of behavior that was expected on the platform, right? Because if you give a user sort of the Chrome of a product, and you haven't put any content in it, and you just ask them to start using it, you're going to see some weird, unexpected behaviors. So there were some markets, I think Indonesia was an example, in which we didn't do any marketing, and all of a sudden in comes this exponential organic growth, right? And which was great, we're excited. All of a sudden this market started to take off. But then we looked at the content they were creating, and it was horrendous. And it was horrendous because we had yet to seed that market with the sort of content that demonstrated the behavior that was expected in the product. And so it was sort of the Chrome of Quora's app, just kind of blank. And you'd see this prompt that said, ask a question. And so somebody would ask, like, how's your day going? And 50 people would respond like, it sucks. We're thinking, no, that's not how Quora is meant to be used. And so we took some pretty drastic measures in terms of shutting down all signups from Indonesian IPs and even eliminating those accounts. We just wiped the slate clean. And we waited many, many, many months until we could open it back up where there was content that demonstrated the expected behavior. And that is a key part. So not only doing the work yourself to establish that initial momentum, if that opportunity presents itself, and leaning on your friends and family and your loved ones to do that, but demonstrating an expected behavior that then predicts the modeling of future user behavior.
So what's the revenue model of Quora? It's a paid ads or ads?
Ads.
Ads. Okay, so again, right, starting off, just loading up questions and answers on this site, broad as ever, right? Any question ever could possibly be on Quora, right? Like, how did you choose which questions to answer? Who was your customer?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. It goes back to the product market fit thing. You said, well, we don't want everyone in the world to start creating content. We want some people from the Silicon Valley too, right? So the initial topic, and to this day, Quora is just a honeypot for amazing information on startups, venture capital, fundraising, and that's what we were writing about. There were a lot of venture capitalists who were friends of the founder, some of the employees, or just people we reached out to through our extended network, where if we could just get one great answer and one great question from them, we were satisfied.
Did you stick on the content side there, or did you go into any other verticals within marketing in Quora?
So some of the verticals we intentionally set out to create, other verticals just took a life of their own. Somebody who was, for example, it turned out that at San Quentin Prison in the Bay Area, which is a very serious place, there is a program within San Quentin where some of the inmates are allowed to participate along with some people who help out at the penitentiary to help train them on computer skills to fight recidivism, right? To prevent the situation where somebody gets released from prison, they don't have skills that they develop that they can go and apply towards getting a job, and consequently they may end up back in prison. And they had this program in there that taught tech skills. And one of the things that these inmates in this program were allowed to do is answer questions on Quora. But they weren't actually given access to a laptop or to a phone. What the director of this program would do was would print up questions that were asked on Quora, like what's it like to be on death row? And he would bring those to inmates who would write it down by hand. He would then take it and type it up and post it. Like really, really, truly profound stuff that that really just took a life of its own. And then when we saw this incredible content coming from people and from organizations that we never expected, we just fostered that. And we built a very close relationship with the inmates in San Quentin. A handful of us actually went there and spent an entire day with them. They did pitches as part of this program through which they learned technical skills. And these are like the best damn pitches I have ever seen. Just exceptional pitches from some of the inmates, many of which are now really happy, productive members of society who are contributing to the world of technology in the Bay Area.
Interesting. So with Quora is a content site, right? Like, so, I hear a lot from founders or partners that, yes, we can do content, but man, it's gonna take forever to see a meaningful return on this, right? So, like, from the early days, like, how how did that reach a critical mass, right? Like, what was the timeline there? What did it take? Were there any, it's harder and harder to hack Google's algorithm day by day, right? But like, what were some things that you guys did that maybe sped up the process or allowed you to see a return on your content faster than usual?
It was really just the emphasis on quality, right? Because to your point, it's incredibly difficult to gamify Google, right? And they've been saying this from day one, content is king. And they've had their battles with spammers who make it really hard to identify high quality content and to serve that up highly in the search results. But for the most part, they've been profoundly successful at this. So the way in which we thought about SEO at Quora early on was, provide features in the product experience that make composing great content very easy and enjoyable, because you don't want there to be friction there that prevents somebody from sharing something amazing. You just want it to be dead simple. But the key really was just providing that platform so that people could put information on the web that didn't exist elsewhere. So there wasn't anything clever in terms of any optimization that we did to outrank other people. We did the fundamentals, like make sure the page is fast and all the basics like pretty URLs and clean internal linking and a lot of text on the page. But that was easy to do. Now,
all the really boring stuff that actually works.
Yeah, it really works. Mm-hmm. It's and to your point, it was low and slow growth to begin with. When I joined, we had 10,000 users. It was not a big product, but you fast forward to today, 7-8 years later, and Quora has, I think the last that they shared, because they don't really share anything from a press perspective. It's a pretty quiet company, but the last I saw they shared, they're doing 200 million visitors a month now.
That's a lot. It's a lot of ad revenue.
It's a lot of eyeballs.
Yeah. So, and from that perspective, you guys got to product market fit somehow, and then had to scale it after. Did you do a raise at that point, or did you guys have? How'd that look?
Yeah, and again, this is, it's such a bad outlier. And I say it's a bad outlier because the founder of the company is the original CTO of Facebook. His name's Adam D'Angelo. He's exceptionally talented and gifted. And I say it's an outlier because from a fundraising standpoint, there's a point at which he plugged in $20 million of his own and said, let's go do this. It's not as if everyone in this room can do it. And so that's why I say it's a bad example.
So choose your founders wisely is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's an important aspect of it.
Otherwise,
or be that founder in 5 years.
Otherwise,
or 10 years.
Like the core strategy itself of seeding the market with the sort of information that you want the rest of the community to replicate, doing the elbow work yourself. In the absence of being able to raise that much money, the playbook wouldn't have changed. Probably would have hired people more slowly and then focused on getting to profitability more quickly. But otherwise, the strategy would have remained identical.
All right. I think that's enough for growth. What do you guys think? Okay. So Afterlife, right? You've now left Wealthfront, former president, right? And thinking through some things, potentially injecting money into startups. So what do VCs look for? We are as far away as possible, except for Hawaii, for God's sake, right? What are VCs or investors or angels looking for outside of Silicon Valley? Is there more interest there? Is there less interest? And how do we find them? How does all that work?
Yeah, so I left Wealthfront recently due to some health issues with my heart. Good news is it's still working. I think I've identified they thought it was going to stop working suddenly, which was the original concern. I said, okay, I should go and look at this. But I've remained an advisor to the company. Because it's an incredible business and I love the people and I'm thankful that they're allowing me to stay involved. But now I'm starting to spend more time pursuing the investing side. And so to the question of What are Silicon Valley VCs looking for? In particular for companies local to Silicon Valley but outside of it, I actually think the similarities are pretty consistent. So there's a few things that I can speak to myself, and I've heard a lot of other great early stage investors mention, and I'll bring a few of those up. The first is, and I gravitate heavy towards this, is the authenticity of the origin of the business. I'll give you an example of an inauthentic pitch. A couple students who graduate from business school, it sounds real fun and sexy to be a CEO founder. This is an actual pitch I heard. They showed me a version of what was effectively Pinterest, but with some UI tweaks that made it easier and a bit more fun to like pin stuff. And that was basically the pitch, which was an easier to use version of Pinterest. What is authentic about that story? Not much. And here's why I think the authenticity matters. Because startups are brutally hard. Really, really, really hard. Whether you're an employee or you're the founder, startups are very, very difficult. And if the problem is not authentic to you, you're not going to have enough passion for it. If you don't have enough passion for it, you're not going to stick it out when times get tough, and they absolutely will get tough. Rocco and I were actually chatting about this before he came on stage. And that's one of the reasons why the authenticity is important, is you have to be in love with this vision of the future or the problem that you're solving, such that you'll stick it out for the long run. The other reason why authenticity is important is great startups are usually built based on contrarian points of view. For example, if early on, if you heard the pitch of, okay, so here's an app that allows you to hail a random stranger, and you get in that stranger's car and they drive you to another place, right? Like, back then, when that pitch was first shared to some early investors, there are an awful lot of early investors that passed on it because, holy hell, that's a contrarian point of view. That just doesn't seem like something that the average person had sort of considered on a day-to-day basis. But you know, when you compare it to the experience of taking, say, Yellow Cab, in retrospect, it's pretty obvious, right? Because taking taxis is a vastly inferior experience. But because that problem was authentic to the founders at the time, whether it's Uber or Lyft or any of the other companies, it didn't matter that they were rejected so many times, right? It just seemed like this is something that would make sense to them. So they were contrarian. They had a point of view that nobody else believed in. And if you're passionate about something because the problem is authentic to you, you're going to stick to that contrarian point of view no matter how many times an investor tells you, sorry, this just seems too crazy. And look, sometimes you're going to be wrong, right? But that's the whole point of it, is like every now and then, if you're really, really right on that one thing of which you were exceptionally contrarian, it pays off. It really, really pays off.
So if you're looking into Miami, right? What are you looking for? Is there anything different outside that you're looking for? And for all of us out here, is what are the benefits of actually not being there?
Yeah. So one of the things that I look for is, and this is, I guess, if I were to share some advice with folks in the room today, is solve those problems that are authentic to you based on who you are here in the life that you've lived. Don't try and solve problems that are more authentic or endemic to Silicon Valley or Berlin, or solve the problems that you're intimately aware of and familiar with. And so the thing that I'm looking for, whether I'm in Miami or I'm in Berlin or Barcelona or anything like that, is I'm looking for the founders who make me aware of a problem that I'd never even thought of or considered, likely because it's something that isn't present based on where I'm at in the Silicon Valley or in California, right? And so the thing to avoid is don't try and solve the problems that everyone else is trying to solve just because you see that happening in the Silicon Valley. Sometimes that makes sense, but one of the most rewarding things is for me to like step out of the Silicon Valley and see what other people are building, and I realized, like, holy shit, that's clever. I would have never thought about that. Or I wasn't even aware that this was a problem because it's not endemic to the Silicon Valley or California. Those are the delightful moments.
So how do you fall in or avoid the pitfall of, okay, because I've had my share of no's from VCs and in regards to market, right? So it's okay. Well, solve the problem that Miami's or your demographic or whatnot is that the problem exists in this market. But the caveat to that is, well, that market seems a little small.
Which could be true. That could be true. But there are plenty of small market ideas in the Silicon Valley, too. The vast majority of the startups I don't want to invest in is because I don't feel inspired by it. I don't feel inspired by it because likely there isn't a big enough market there because it doesn't seem like it's solving an interesting enough problem. So here's an example of, there's a company that I recently was connected with, and I hope to be able to invest in. Where
we're not taking any money. I'm sorry.
the founders from India is based in Palo Alto temporarily, but the problem that he's working on, and I just really hadn't thought about this, is let's imagine that you're in one country and you would love to be able to import a product from another country, but for a variety of reasons, it's either really, really hard to import that product through sort of formal traditional means, or there's a multi-month delay before that product is rolled out to your market. Like there's an awful lot of friction when it comes to bringing a product from, say, the United States into India for a whole host of systemic reasons. And there's an awful lot of people that are like, hey, give me the new iPhone right now, right? Like just bring that in. Don't give me this multi-week or multi-month delay or whatever the product may be. And the solution that they introduced was, well, if somebody's probably going to be flying from the United States to India, that person could just buy it and bring it over. And ta-da, an interesting new little marketplace is popping up where it's like, screw trying to solve all these like international trade challenges that are incredibly complex to unpack and likely unique on a country-by-country basis. Well, there's a lot of people that are flying around the world I think on any given day, there's a couple million people in the air. Allow them to be the mule and bring over whatever the product is. And then, lo and behold, you've got some really highly engaged customers. And that's an example of, this was a founder who is from a country who's experienced this issue over and over and over again. And it's actually a gigantic market because the vast majority of the world actually feels the same way when it comes to Western products. And that would have never come to mind with me sitting in Palo Alto.
So far you and I have discussed drug dealers and mules now. So you're definitely fitting in with Miami so far in our history. Any geographies you're excited about?
Any geographies?
Like when you see things happening or see things budding, right? Like, you see all this data of like, oh, this is the new Silicon Valley, or this is up and coming, or does that even cross your mind, or is it more I'm looking for people, I'm looking for particular problems?
I tend to spend less time sort of obsessing over a region, and instead I just try to obsess over finding the authentic founders. I am personally pretty excited with Los Angeles right now. I think that what's starting to happen there as a result of the Snapchats and a few other companies being successful is the seeds of new capital have been planted, and I think the seeds of optimism and this belief that you don't have to be in the Silicon Valley because look, there are a couple other people that they've succeeded right now. And I personally get really excited by that because the prices that we have to pay to hire people in the Silicon Valley is outrageous. If I'm going to bring on an Android engineer, $200,000.
So you hear that, founders with exits, reinvest your capital into other. Is Chewy out here? Are they in here?
Like
$3 billion.
I've been in this situation where you make a $200,000 cash offer to an Android engineer, and they're like, "I love you, can't wait, super excited," and then Facebook says, "Here's $400,000," and that engineer says, sorry, I'm going to go to Facebook. That happens over and over and over. It is immensely demoralizing. So the labor market is so absurdly expensive there. Meanwhile, there's a company in LA that I invested in that has a bunch of phenomenal Caltech engineers, and the fully weighted monthly, or the fully weighted annual salary for their employee base is like 63 grand. And it's like a third or a fourth of.
So authentic founders solving a problem that's near and dear to them, right, in their market. What else?
And to be more specific, is related to the authenticity thing, is when I'm hearing the pitch, what I'm looking for is ultimate clarity around the problem they're solving and for who in particular. Remember what I said earlier around if you're trying to market it and position it to everyone, you're going to be positioning it to nobody. The other thing is, and these successful things, they start with a very small target market to begin with. And the other thing is when a founder can articulate with supreme clarity the problem they're solving and who they're doing it for, it communicates to me that this is likely somebody who has a tendency towards focus and execution as opposed to an abundance of ideas that they can't execute against. So it's incredibly important to me. The other is it tells me that they're remaining very, very close with their customer. And so right. I'll ask them questions like, tell me about your first 10 users. Who are they? Where are they from? How'd they find you? If they don't have answers to those questions, I'm immediately worried.
Right. So we're past product market fit in our company, and we're still working on this stuff. So it doesn't end, right? Like just because you know your first 10 doesn't mean you should know, the next 100,000. Not all of them, but really understanding that customer. I mean, we're going back into it now from that perspective.
Yeah, and just to put a little color on that, so when I gave the example earlier of Tesla sold the Model 3 to about 3,000 people, the first product, a very narrow customer segment, they've effectively just been expanding in these concentric circles outwards, where with each new model, they're appealing to a new demographic. And so to your point, it's essential that they understand who is this new demographic, what are their sensibilities, and what do they need in a car? Because if they don't do that, they're not going to be able to successfully expand in those concentric circles to increasingly large markets.
Makes sense. Any closing comments before we open it up for questions?
No, I really want to, well, I should say thank you for having me here. This is... It truly is one of the most enjoyable parts of my career, is just being able to try and share some knowledge that will hopefully be helpful, such that every now and then there's something I say or I can do, or I can see 6 months of stumbling through a hard problem or trying to figure something out get condensed down into a day or a week. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and to be a part of the community.
Thank you. So I think we have time for like 3 questions, so make them good. Up first is John.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Rocco. Andy, thank you. Awesome having you out here. That was an awesome talk from all the different various topics you were going into. That was awesome. I have kind of a personal question. I found it interesting, and I really aligned myself with what you're talking about, organic and exponential growth. And it sounds like all the different companies you've been in, that's been your approach to how you've done growth. I mean, you're doing SEO at Facebook, so that's very organic, obviously. And then we got to the core thing, and you're building it organically, only to then on the flip side be selling advertising, which I thought was very interesting. Not to take away from what people can build organically through core. I know a local startup here, Kairos, built their marketing, a big chunk of it, or some incredible results through core. But then on the advertising side, did you ever have any sort of inner struggle with that while you were working on that?
That's a good question, especially in light of, I think, the recent scrutiny that a variety of public companies are receiving from a privacy standpoint. On the core side, no, we didn't really, or at least personally, I didn't really engage in that discussion and debate, because monetization was never talked about. The founder of the company did a great job from the very beginning of saying, like, focus on quality of content. And the entire time I was there, I think I heard the word IPO once. And it was sort of a negative culture symbol or signal if you were thinking about how are we going to make money already. Now, if I were to sort of speculate a little bit or to throw out sort of my own questions or commentary on it, I personally would love to see somebody figure out how to move away from advertising-driven systems, just because, as you're seeing with companies like Facebook, it creates a lot of very, very challenging conflicts from a business and product standpoint, which that company is going to continue to go through over time. I suspect that for products like Quora, which collects significantly less personal information, it's going to be less of an issue in the same way that it is for, say, Reddit, which similarly gets a lot of eyeballs but doesn't really garner any attention from like a privacy standpoint. The thing I can say really, really positively about an advertising business is if executed well on some platforms, advertisements are actually additive to the user experience. And so if you ask yourself, like, what examples prior to Google can you think of where advertisements improved the user experience? It's very, very hard to come up with any examples. The only one I can come up with is the Yellow Pages, right? And where you got this big book, like once a month or whatever, that would show up on your front door. And you could argue that the ads there improved the experience of Yellow Pages. It's completely useless today, of course. But for example, if I go to Google and I search for what is the best A/B testing tool for startups, I'm going to see some organic results, and I'm also going to see some paid results. And I find that in many situations, engaging with the ads leads me to the product or the experience that I want to use, especially because within that ad auction, a significant portion of the auction is quality of the advertisement. And so sort of all the cream floats to the top. And that's the beauty of those online ad auctions is you have a constrained number of ad impressions. You have millions of advertisers who are sort of bidding into that auction. And unless the ad is high quality, it won't be scored high enough such that it can even receive some of those impressions. And if you take that example of going to Google and searching for what is the best A/B testing tool for startups, that intent is exceptionally high, such that an ad that is served for, say, Mixpanel or something like that would be incredibly relevant. And the same is true for Quora. If I go into Quora, I'm not necessarily searching for what is the best A/B testing tool for analytics. Maybe I stumble, A/B testing tool for startups. Maybe I stumble into that through my feed, or maybe I do actually search for it. Nonetheless, the intent is incredibly high, and ads within a Quora experience are additive to the user experience itself. So I think it's one of the few examples of products on the web where advertising on the whole is beneficial to the users of the product, especially at scale.
As more and more of the really big investment managers, banks, et cetera, get into things that compete more directly with what Wealthfront is doing, how do you see Wealthfront staying ahead of all the others like Vanguard or Schwab, whether it's on kind of the asset side or even in other services like money transfer? You had Venmo and PayPal, but now you have Zelle, which already has such adoption simply because the very, very big incumbents are going with it. So I'm curious about how you see the small startups staying ahead of these very, very big companies, in particular in fintech.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. The answer to that is playing the long game. So there's a couple parts to it. You look at institutions like Schwab, which has $4 trillion of assets under management with a T. And big finance has been an oligarchy. There are multiple institutions that have trillions of assets. I think JP Morgan's got somewhere around 2 trillion. Morgan Stanley's got 1.5 to 2 trillion. There's trillions, right? So first, that reveals that there's room. This is a truly big market, 20 to 30 trillion in just the United States. So there's plenty of room for multiple entrants in there. The second I mentioned is it's going to take a long time because people make financial decisions, especially significant ones related to investing for the long term, when certain life events provoke them to. They have a kid, they just got a big promotion or a windfall, somebody in their family passed away. Like, these are the sort of things that drive people to make financial decisions, but those happen episodically. They don't all just happen right away, and one person doesn't decide that they're going to slug all their money into one financial institution. The other is we're targeting a segment of the market that they are not. That they're incapable of serving from a technology standpoint because they are not technology companies. They like to try and brand themselves as if they are, and Schwab is doing this right now with a lot of the language that they use publicly, but they are not technology companies. And in fact, because they are not technology companies, there's a huge conflict of interest, or what you could really call the innovator's dilemma internally. So we can deliver world-class investment management at a 0.25%, right? And we can do this because of software. Traditional financial advisors charge 1% to 2% per year. And an awful lot of traditional advisors and wealth managers, are sort of compelled by the potential for large financial gain because of the 1% to 2% of assets under management that are being charged. Now, if you tell that advisor, sorry, you're going to need to drop your management fee to 0.5% or 0.25% to compete, they no longer stand to benefit as much financially, and there would be a tremendous amount of sort of pushback. And so it's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of Blockbuster needing to get rid of all of its stores and develop streaming technology. It's not a technology company, and then you're asking it to throw away its entire business model to replace it with something new. And you're asking them to do that in the context of already being a publicly traded company and the amount of resistance that is faced from that. So I think that these large financial institutions, they face a genuine innovator's dilemma in that they're going to have to become technology companies. They're going to have to shy away from having 16,000 financial advisors like most of the large financial institutions do. And they're going to have to become privy with how young investors like us want to have our money managed. A direct quote from one of our customers is, "I pay you to not talk to you," which is a complete opposite of the traditional model. Like, it's annoying every time I get a message on LinkedIn from somebody at Morgan Stanley offering to take me to a baseball game. I'm like, you don't get it. I don't care about your free Giants tickets. That's not how I want my money managed, right? Give me an app in my phone and don't bother me, and make it really low cost. And better yet, keep making it better over time. And that's the promise of what software and technology can do. Continues to innovate. So think about your Netflix experience. All right, they might charge you $10 a month, and then every year or two they send you an email saying that they're going to increase the price by $2. You don't even hesitate because you know you're going to get 50 more or 100 more original programs for that $2 increase in fee. And so the value relative to the fee that is charged is a no-brainer, and that's what software does. So, like, no doubt, this is a really brutal industry. And the big institutions are exceptional at a few things, which is why they have 3, 4, or 5 trillion of assets. But the long game that Wealthfront is playing is to be software only, build this over multiple generations or over the next couple decades to eventually get it to $1 trillion of assets under management and to entirely do that online. Now, if somebody else, say Goldman Sachs, is able to transition into an incredibly healthy technology company, great. that likely means a better outcome for the average investor. And that's the whole purpose of this.
Last question? Right? Oh.
Hi. So you've been on both sides of the coin, one where you were with a company that needed to raise money, and now you're an experienced investor. If you could go back, knowing what you know now as an experienced investor, where do you think that sweet spot is between bootstrapped or having raised money from friends and family, and then going out to the market to look for money from more institutional experienced investors?
It's a nuanced question and answer because it depends. So, for example, some ideas are so big and hairy that you're going to need a lot of capital. For example, there's a company I invested in recently called Ford. Ford is in the healthcare space. Terrifying space to enter in general, because how do you transform healthcare, right? Their approach was, you know what, we're not going to go into the existing healthcare system and try and plant a seed and rebuild it from scratch over the next 50 years. We're going to build a parallel system that has no dependencies on the legacy of healthcare. And I think the seed round was somewhere in the ballpark, seed Series A, $100 million. And it's led by somebody who used to be the head of Google's artificial intelligence division, and who ran a bunch of special projects for Larry and Sergey at Google X. There's some things that are so just really audacious like that you're going to need several $100 million to try and build a brand, like an old industry from scratch. So you can take that and sort of throw those off the table, right? Those are outliers, and I don't think there's any way around it other than get a couple very special people with a huge vision who have friends with very, very deep pockets who would be happy to give them $10 million a piece even if they lost every penny of it, right? And Ford is an example of that. But they're doing something truly exceptional, and I think they've got a chance. For other companies, for other startups in general, I go off of what has always been my internal bias when I'm at startups as an employee, which is I deeply value profitability and independence and getting there as fast as possible. In most cases, there are some markets where it's a horse race, right? You can go back to Groupon and Living Social, where there aren't any real barriers preventing entrance into the market other than a lot of capital and going gangbusters on it. So in some of those cases, you just got to raise money to try and buy the market before your competition does. But in the vast majority of other cases, moving that other outlier aside, I value profitability as soon as possible. And one of the reasons I do is when I spend time with founders of companies, often the advice I give them is play more offense and less defense. So an example of this would be is if you're running your own startup, you're negotiating insurance contracts, you're purchasing desks, you're doing a bunch of this mundane stuff that slows you down, and you're not focused on building your product, you're not focused on talking to your customer, you're not focused on selling. Right? Those are the things in which you're playing offense. And when you're constantly fundraising, sure, you could argue that that's offense, but I argue that it's defense in more cases than not. And the other aspect of it is I've seen from my 15 years of being at startups that when you're pursuing capital so that you can fundraise the business in subtle ways, but in some ways that can actually be quite negative, it influences your thinking and your decision making around short term versus long term. And if I see a company that's in a position where it doesn't have to play land grab and it doesn't have to buy the market, or if it doesn't need an absurd amount of capital to stand up a business within an existing industry that has way too much legacy to play in, the advice that I generally like to give them is try and raise less than you think. At the end of the day, If you take a lot of very smart people and you resource constrain them, you're going to focus them to make the best decisions possible, and you're going to force focus upon them. And when you have too much money, it's no different at a startup than it is a venture capital firm. Your decision making gets lazy, you get frivolous, and you spend less time, frankly, being cutthroat with respect to how you spend your time. So all those factors included, I really recommend get to profitability with as little outside investment as you can. And at the end of the day, you're going to own more of your company as a result.
Help me give one more round of applause for Rocco and Andy.